Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering spells. This is of course an update to my previous spells tier list because enough has changed in the last year both mechanically in the game and in my evaluations that I wanted to go over the spells again to make a much more definitive honor mode tier list. So we'll be going over every single spell in the game, its strengths and weaknesses, the best characters to make use of it, and how to get the most out of casting it, so that we can make the most complicated system and one of the most important choices in the game, which spells to use, simple and easy. How I'm rating these spells is very simple. Should you learn or prepare them on characters that have access to them, and if you cast them frequently, will you be more likely to win honor mode? Of course, as with any tier list, the actual tier that a spell goes in is the least important part of it, so consider this a jumping off point for learning about the spells. And also the most important part of a spell is that you have fun using it, so if you enjoy a spell that I have rated lower, then definitely keep casting it. I'm also going to be making two assumptions while rating these spells. First, that you aren't long resting after every single encounter. Obviously, that's a totally viable and even optimal playstyle, but when resource management isn't a real consideration, it makes a spell tier list much less useful because you just use your highest level spell slots every single turn of combat. And secondly, that most of your spell casting is done by your active party rather than by camp casters. The stats that we have show that that's by far the more common playstyle. Most players don't use camp casters, and again, when resources are free, evaluating the spells is much less interesting. Though I will mention when a spell is particularly good to be cast by a camp follower. In S tier, these are spells that are critical. Pretty much every character that has access to these spells will want to take them and use them constantly, and you'll often structure your party composition specifically around having access to these spells. In A tier, these are great spells that will be the workhorses of your party. They'll be excellent uses of your turn and your spell slot, and will be mainstays of your strategy if your party has access to them, but maybe you won't build an entire character specifically for just this spell. In B tier, these are spells that are extremely useful. While you may not use them every encounter, they're either going to have a ton of utility or provide really high impact in certain situations, or just be a great secondary option if your S and A tier spells are less impactful in that scenario. In C tier, these marginal spells are still useful, but maybe they're only for specific builds or for a very narrow subset of encounters, so while you can still definitely get some use out of them, they're going to be more uncommon picks. And then finally, in D tier, these are spells that are overall pretty weak and can usually be safely skipped, although even these do sometimes still have their uses in certain very specific situations. And finally, before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Monkey C. Poo for the £20 donation, as well as Lingus Liquor for the $5, great names to have in the same donor shoutout, as well as Travis Barnum, Lucas Tomsu, and Doug NYC for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Alright, let's talk spells. We're going to start with a nice easy one, Animal Friendship. Animal Friendship is a wisdom save, single target, though by casting it with a higher level spell slot, you can increase the number of targets. Only can target an animal, and if they fail the wisdom save, then they become charmed for 10 turns. The charm condition prevents that character from attacking the spellcaster, but they can still freely attack your allies, so for the most part, even if you land this spell on an animal, they'll still just take their turn as normal. Like Charm Person, it can also be used in dialogue to gain advantage on charisma checks, so any conversation checks that you're making in dialogue with an animal. But that's rarely going to come up in Baldur's Gate because the vast majority of dialogue checks that you would make with an animal, you can just auto-succeed on. The existence of Speak with Animals lets you auto-succeed on most of those checks, or you can bypass them in some other way, or they're not impactful or not very high. So Animal Friendship used in dialogue is rarely going to come up. Used in combat, it's also extremely weak. It is probably the weakest crowd control condition in the game, and if you're going to make an animal fail a wisdom save, why not make them fail something like command, and then you actually just win the fight outright, rather than this minor debuff. And even aside from the fact that it's a relatively low impact spell, it also only works in some of the easiest encounters in the game. There's very few animal fights in Baldur's Gate 3, and they are typically not threatening encounters. There's a couple that can be a little more difficult, but again, you can just use better crowd control on them, so animal friendship just doesn't ever come up in a useful way. D tier. Armour of Agathys. Armour of Agathys is a warlock spell and is also available to draconic sorcerers using the White Dragon bloodline, and it gives you 5 temporary hit points, and when you are struck by a melee attacker, they take 5 cold damage. This effect lasts until those temp HP are depleted or until long rest, so you can have this up all day as long as you can preserve the temporary hit points. By itself, 5 temp HP and 5 damage, not that exciting. But when you upcast Armour of Agathys, you get 5 more temp HP and 5 more retaliation damage per level. Since it's cold damage, you can also double the retaliation damage against a wet enemy, because cold and lightning damage doubles against enemies who have the wet condition. So this can be a lot of retaliation damage. Since this is a warlock spell, a lot of the time when you cast it, you're going to be upcasting it for free, because warlocks always use their highest level spell slot. So with a level 5 spell, with a high level warlock, you get 25 temp HP and 25 cold damage. You can combine this with sources of damage reduction, like Blade Ward, or heavy armor that comes with inherent damage reduction, in order to preserve these temp HP, and end up doing a lot of additional damage to melee attackers over the course of the game. By default, this is a pretty solid pickup for warlocks. The 25 temp HP that they get at high level lets them turn a short rest resource, a warlock spell slot, into a long rest benefit, because Armour of Agathys lasts until it goes away, which is always a great trade. And also, there's a lot of builds that can be built around maximizing Armour of Agathys. The most impactful of these is the Abjuration Wizard, whose Arcane Ward damage reduction means that Armour of Agathys temporary temp HP will last forever, and every melee attacker is going to take 60 cold damage in return as long as you get them wet. So obviously that's a huge amount of additional damage that you can deal to enemies. And that's one of the most powerful builds in the game, an Abjuration Wizard with a level of Warlock or Sorcerer in order to pick up Armour of Agathys, will just break the game in half. For a normal Warlock, this is still a solid option, but if you're building around it, then it's absolutely incredible. For that reason, we're going to give it A tier. Even if you aren't building around it, it's still an excellent use of a spell slot, and some of the most powerful builds in the game are specifically built around maximizing Armour of Agathys. Arms of Hadar. Arms of Hadar is the first damage spell on this list, and when you're evaluating a damage spell, there's really one overriding consideration, which is how much damage does it do. You usually don't want to cast a damage spell that does less than the most damage available at that level, because that's what you're typically casting damage spells to do, is the most damage possible. Arms of Hadar does 2d6 of necrotic damage, which is pretty low for a first level spell slot, in a 10-foot radius around the caster. If you can group up a lot of enemies and run your Warlock into the middle of them, then you can hit a decent amount of damage with this, but that, of course, puts a relatively squishy character, unless you're a Hexblade, into a fairly dangerous situation, so may not be viable to get the maximum damage out of this spell. Enemies also get a strength save for half damage, so that 2d6 can become effectively 1d6, and if they fail the save and take the full damage, they also can't take reactions for a turn. Preventing reactions is typically pretty good in Baldur's Gate, but much less important at low levels when this spell is most likely to be cast. So the debuff is not that strong, the damage is low, and it's fairly awkward to get into position to cast this spell. At higher levels, if you upcast it, you only get 1 extra d6 of damage per level, so it does not scale well for a Warlock. So at low levels, it's pretty weak, and at higher levels, it's even worse. Most players' first encounter with Arms of Hadar is also going to be Will casting it in the fight outside the Druid Grove for absolutely no value, so you're going to get a bad impression of this spell right away, and that bad impression is correct. Arms of Hadar just does way too little damage to be worth spending a spell slot on. Being a strength save is marginally interesting, but it would only be good if it actually did enough damage to make enemies likely failing the save worth it. Arms of Hadar, D tier. Next up, Bane. Bane is a spell that can be a little bit non-intuitive to rate, because while thematically and numerically it's the opposite of Bless, so you might think these two spells go together, they actually fill very different roles, and if you compare them directly, then you're going to misevaluate the use of these two spells. Bane is a concentration debuff. It can target up to 3 creatures, plus 1 per level that you upcast the spell, within 30 feet. Those creatures have to make a charisma saving throw, or for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration, they take a minus 1d4 penalty to their attack rolls and to their saving throws. This is obviously not a huge penalty, but it's a little more relevant than it sounds like at first. Dungeons & Dragons is pretty carefully balanced around odds of success, and 5th edition, the system Baldur's Gate 3 is based on, uses a system called bounded accuracy, meaning that weapons and spell effects typically fall within a fairly tightly constrained array of probabilities. No matter the weapon you're using or the target or the level of the character, you are never going to have odds of success that are too high or too low. So even small penalties can tip enemies over that point, to the point where your more dangerous crowd control spells land very reliably, and where enemy attacks can't hit your high AC characters. In the early game, this is still not worth spending a spell slot on. A level 1 spell slot for an extremely small debuff is just not worth the expenditure, because that represents a fairly high proportion of your party's total resources. But interestingly enough about Bane, this is a spell that actually gets significantly better as you get later into the game. There's a couple reasons for this. In the late game, a lot of enemies have significant differences between their saving throws. Their strong saving throws will be very hard to land saves on, and their weak saving throws, which often include Charisma, the save that Bane targets, will be much easier to land spells on. So even though Bane is a weaker effect than something like Command, you might be able to land Bane much more easily, and then you can use that penalty to land a more dangerous spell like Command or Hold Person on a higher Wisdom save. Also, a lot of bosses in the late game are immune to a lot of the more dangerous spells out there, but very few enemies are immune to Bane, so this, in a longer fight, is a penalty that you can actually apply to late game bosses, even if they're immune to a lot of the other things that your characters can do. So Bane, while you will never want to cast it in early levels, it definitely has its place in some late game fights. It's not going to be your go-to spell, but there are times where casting it and spending your concentration on this penalty can actually be fairly useful. It also is fairly easy to target. It's any enemies within 30 feet, you just choose 3 of them. So even if the battlefield is fairly confused, you can still sometimes land Bane. There are other ways to apply this debuff. There are items and stuff that do it, but actually casting the spell in late game encounters can be a totally reasonable thing to do. I'm going to give it B tier, although I will say that this is a spell that you're going to use only in fights that are going to go long and only in the late game. So it's fairly good in those scenarios, but if you use it outside of them, it's going to be weaker, so this is a spell you need to pay attention to when you're using, hence B tier. Next up, Bless. So Bless is numerically the opposite of Bane. You cast it on your allies, up to 3 characters with a first level slot, plus 1 per level that you upcast it, lasts for 10 turns, requires your concentration, and gives you plus 1d4 to your attack rolls and to your saving throws. This is an enormous bonus. The amount that you get from this is absurd. A plus 1d4 bonus is an average of an additional 2.5 on each of these rolls. And a level 1 character should have a plus 5 bonus to their chance to hit with their attacks. So adding 2.5 increases their hit bonus by 50%. Imagine also a character that has an 80% chance of hitting their attacks. Adding 2.5 to that increases their hit chance by 12.5%, just a flat additional 12.5%. To 92.5%. So that character, with previously an 80% hit chance, has less than half the chance of missing if they have Bless on than they did without it. Over the course of a long playthrough, that's going to convert an enormous number of misses into hits, an enormous number of failed saving throws into successes. And since hitting with your attacks and succeeding on saving throws are basically the 2 most important things that you do in Baldur's Gate 3, this spell giving you a hugely impactful bonus to those things is absolutely incredible. Every character that is making attack rolls should try to have Bless on at all times. It's just such an enormous bonus to your ability to land your attacks. It also by itself makes a lot of characters that come with attack penalties much more viable. If you have Great Weapon Master, for example, you can significantly offset the penalty of that with Bless and land the extra damage from Great Weapon Master or Sharpshooter vastly more reliably, thanks to the existence of this spell. The bonus is ridiculous. I can't overstate how important this effect is to your playthroughs. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, there is one thing that holds the actual spell Bless back a little bit, and that's the existence of the Whispering Promise Ring. This ring lets you apply Bless to any creature that you heal, so you can wear this ring and get Bless for free. It lasts for 2 turns, doesn't take your concentration, and can be applied in an AoE by throwing a healing potion at your allies or something like that. So you'll often see people say that you don't need to take the Bless spell because the Whispering Promise exists. I don't think that's actually true, though. The spell Bless lasts for 10 turns. It will last the entire combat. You can cast it before combat starts, so you don't spend an action on it, and then if the combat goes longer than 1 turn, you still have Bless, which is very, very important. You don't have to reapply it during the fight, because you can just maintain concentration on it, so you're not going to spend actions on healing in order to reapply the Bless. So actually knowing the spell Bless, which is just such an absurdly impactful spell, I think is still extremely important. S tier. Next up, Burning Hands. Burning Hands is another damage spell, a 17-foot cone with a dexterity saving throw for half that does 3d6 fire damage. This is a decent amount of damage for a first level spell, and it's in an AoE, so that part is good, but it does require your character to get fairly close to the enemies in order to cast, and it targets a dexterity save, which is one of the worst saves to target, especially in the early game when your enemies are often goblins or spiders or things like that have very strong dexterity saves, so you will often have enemies succeed and take only half damage from this spell. Now, any spell that can do guaranteed damage to an enemy is still pretty useful, because if an enemy is at low health, Burning Hands is always going to kill them pretty much. Even if they take half damage, if they're at 2 health, you're going to be able to finish them off. And if you can do that while putting damage on their healthier allies or finish off a couple low enemies in one go, then that definitely has some uses. That being said, this spell is still a pretty weak way to do that. The AoE is relatively small and close range, so you have to put yourself in a fairly awkward position, and enemies have to be clustered fairly tightly together for you to hit more than 2 of them with Burning Hands reliably, and the amount of damage that it does is fairly low, targeting a fairly bad save. So for most characters with access to Burning Hands, you just aren't going to want to use or cast this spell. If you need guaranteed damage, Magic Missile exists. If you need AoE damage, there are much better options available as well. There's one exception, though, which is that this spell is available to Light Domain Clerics as a domain spell. And since they don't need to actually prepare the spell, they're not wasting a spell preparation slot on it, they will sometimes cast Burning Hands. Having that guaranteed damage for a Light Domain Cleric to be able to finish off an enemy who's at low health is something that you will sometimes use. For that reason, I'll give it C tier, marginal usage for Light Domain Clerics, and it's not a complete 0 for Sorcerers, Wizards, and Fiend Warlocks, but this spell is still relatively weak, and if you never cast it, you honestly wouldn't be missing that much. Charm Person. Charm Person is Animal Friendship, but for people. You cast it on 1 creature per spell level that you upcast it, and they have to make a Wisdom saving throw, otherwise they become charmed and can't attack the caster, but can still freely attack your allies. Enemies or actively hostile creatures also have advantage on this Wisdom save, so it's going to be fairly unreliable to use this in combat, and even if you succeed, it's an extremely marginal effect, so casting this in combat is just a waste of a level 1 spell slot. There are good ways to apply Charm with Archfey Warlock or Glamour Bard, but casting Charm Person is definitely not one of them. Very low impact crowd control, and extremely unreliable used in combat. Just like Animal Friendship, you can also use this in dialogue to gain advantage on charisma checks with the character that you use Charm Person with. And it's a crime on Tactician and Honor mode, all of the same things that work with other charm effects. But friends and Thaumaturgy exist as cantrips, so you can get this effect in dialogue using a cantrip instead of spending a spell slot on it. And obviously you're going to use a cantrip rather than spending a spell slot if you want the effect of advantage on charisma checks in dialogue. So both in dialogue, it's completely superseded by a free effect, and outside and in combat, it's extremely low impact and unreliable. There's basically never any reason to use Charm Person, D tier. Chromatic Orb. Chromatic Orb is another damage spell, but it's also so much more than that. It's an attack roll, so targeting enemy's armor class, and you choose an elemental type when you fire the Chromatic Orb. It will either deal 3d8 thunder damage, very good for a level 1 spell slot, or 2d8 acid, cold, fire, lightning, or poison damage, and create a surface of one of those types. Each of these surfaces is incredibly useful, and the versatility and power of this spell gives it a ton of utility both at low levels and at high levels. Poison Surface you probably won't use that often, it just does a little damage, but it's a little weaker than the fire or lightning versions of the damage surfaces. But fire or lightning damage can be used to finish off low health enemies guaranteed. An enemy standing on a fire will just die. Guaranteed, because they will always take a d4 of fire damage. So the fire or lightning versions can be used similarly to Burning Hands in order to finish off low health enemies while also putting damage on a higher health ally standing near them. Acid surfaces reduce the armor class of creatures standing on them by 2 with no saving throw. So if you need to be able to hit an enemy more easily, the acid surface can set up for all of your allies who roll attacks in order to hit those attacks more frequently. And finally, ice surfaces. Now, ice surfaces are going to come up a lot when we're talking about spells, so it's important to talk about why ice surfaces are so absurdly strong in Baldur's Gate 3. In BG3, when an enemy moves on an ice surface, they have to make a dexterity saving throw or fall prone. When an enemy is prone, when a creature is prone in Baldur's Gate, they can't use any reactions, and you get advantage on attack rolls against them. And if they fall prone on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn. So if you put an ice surface under an enemy and they move, and most enemies will move before they attack, just because the AI usually makes those decisions in that order, they have to make a dexterity saving throw or just get stunned and lose the rest of their turn. And it's even better than stunned because of all the other advantages that prone gives you. So ice surfaces in Baldur's Gate are some of the best crowd control that you can possibly apply. Chromatic Orb lets you do it without a concentration, without concentrating, while also doing a bunch of damage. Chromatic Orb also interacts with another mechanic that's going to come up a lot as we talk about spells, wet. When an enemy is wet, they take double damage from cold or lightning damage, both of which Chromatic Orb very conveniently does. So you can deal 3d8 thunder damage, or if they're wet, 4d8 lightning or cold damage, and if you use cold damage, also apply an extremely powerful crowd control effect. So this spell lets you do some of the best non-concentration crowd control out there, and also do great damage. On top of that, it's incredibly versatile. If an enemy is immune to one of the damage types, well, this does 6 possible damage types. So you can swap to get around immunities or resistance. You can use the surface that has the most impact in the encounter that you're in. So not only is the power level on this spell extremely high, the optionality and versatility is extremely high. A character that can cast this is probably going to spend more of their turns casting Chromatic Orb than doing almost anything else. So it's going straight into S tier. Color Spray. Color Spray is a 17-foot cone that blinds enemies without a saving throw, up to a total combined hit points of 33. So it looks at the enemy's hit point total and then will blind them up until you hit 33 total hit points of creatures blinded. What that means is that in the early game, or if you've done a little bit of damage in an encounter, you'll usually be able to get 2 enemies with this debuff, and then later on you'll only get 1, and then eventually it'll stop hitting anything at all. Blinded for 1 turn without a concentration save is not a particularly powerful debuff, and although any spell that works without a saving throw is worth looking at, Color Spray suffers from a couple major flaws. The first is that against the most dangerous enemies, it doesn't work, because they're going to have high enough hit points to ignore the spell entirely. And second is that if you want an enemy to be blinded for 1 turn without a saving throw, Fog Cloud does that, and then also does a million other things while not caring about enemy hit point totals. So even if Color Spray was an effect that you wanted, there's another spell that does that effect significantly better while also doing a bunch of other stuff besides. And 1 turn of blind is an okay debuff, but not amazing, so it's not even clear that this is an effect you want to spend your action on. Color Spray, very weak spell. Detail. Command. So Command has been talked about more than almost any other spell in Baldur's Gate 3, and with good reason. Command is a control spell. It has 60-foot range with a Wisdom saving throw to negate the effect. And you can target 1 creature with a level 1 spell, plus 1 per level that you upcast the spell, which you're going to be doing pretty often, because this spell is so powerful that casting it using higher level spell slots is a great use of those spell slots. In fact, for any character that has access to Command, you pretty much have to compare every single higher level spell use to what if I just spent this spell slot on upcasting Command instead, and most higher level spells compare unfavorably to that usage of the spell. Command, enemies have to make a Wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, you get to apply 1 of 5 effects: Approach, Drop, Flee, Grovel, and Halt. But 95% of the time you're going to be using Grovel. The other 5% are probably mostly Drop, so I'm going to talk about those two primarily. Command Drop lets you cause an enemy to drop their weapon, so especially on the Nautiloid to get the Everburn Blade, or a couple other situations where you really want a specific weapon, Command Drop is a great use of an action. But mostly you're using Command Grovel. That causes an enemy to drop prone, obviously a very powerful debuff, and skip their next turn. So you trade your action for the enemy's action, or if you upcast the spell, you trade your action for multiple enemies' actions. Dungeons & Dragons is basically about action economy. The goal is to take as many actions as possible and to minimize the number of actions that your enemies are taking. So Command is a great way to do that, because you choose when you trade your action for the enemy action and can maximize the impact and make certain that you are getting more useful turns than your enemies are getting. It doesn't cost your concentration, so you can use it while concentrating on Bless, and for most clerics, their level 1 spell slots are going to be like 90% Bless, Command, and Sanctuary. And Command is what you're going to be doing most often. So this spell works with pretty much any tactic because you can cast it while also doing other stuff. In addition, it has a lot of really powerful combos. It's an enchantment spell, so it works with, as a bonus action, with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, which is a very, very powerful build. It also works with extend spells, so if you're a sorcerer and have the extend spell meta magic, you can get Command that lasts 2 turns, which is 2 turns of concentration-free crowd control, incredibly powerful. If you're a Fiend Warlock, you get this spell and get to upcast it for free, so a Fiend Warlock at level 9 can cast 5-person Command using their normal Warlock spell slots without having to spend higher level resources, so that's incredibly powerful as well. This spell is just so absurdly impactful. A lot of the most powerful builds in the game are built around maximizing Command, and even if you aren't building around it, it is just one of the best things you can possibly do on your turn. It has extremely low opportunity cost because it doesn't require your concentration or anything. And if the enemy fails the save against it, you almost certainly win that combat. S tier for Command, of course. Compelled Duel. Compelled Duel is a paladin spell. It only costs a bonus action to use, which is pretty nice. Any spell that can be cast as a bonus action is worth looking at, because again, action economy is the most important thing. So if you can do 2 impactful things in a turn, then that is going to be extremely useful. It targets 1 enemy, they make a Wisdom saving throw, and if they fail, then they have to attack the caster, gaining disadvantage on their attacks against anything else. However, they don't actually have to attack the caster. In Baldur's Gate 3, the only implemented effect of Compelled Duel is that they have disadvantage on attack rolls against everybody else. If an enemy casts Compelled Duel on you, you lose control of your character completely, and the spell actually works the way that the description says that it does. But when you cast it on an enemy, it basically doesn't function. A bonus action and a first level spell slot to give the enemy disadvantage on their attacks against your allies is not a great trade, and it's especially a bad trade for a paladin because that first level spell slot could just be a smite. And if you and also it requires your concentration, which of course is a real opportunity cost as well, because you could be concentrating on something a little more powerful. If this spell actually did what it said it did and forced the enemies to attack only the paladin, then that would be a much more interesting effect, but since it doesn't, it's just a D tier spell that basically doesn't work. Create or destroy water. I've just called it create water in the tier list because, let's be real, that's what you're using it for almost all the time. Create or destroy water lets you do just that. You can make a big puddle of water. This doesn't sound like a big deal, but in Baldur's Gate 3, being able to summon water is actually pretty significant. There's a lot of times where you want to put out a fire or create a water surface, which you can then hit with cold damage to create an ice surface. Talked about how Chromatic Orb is powerful because it summons an ice surface. Setting up water on the battlefield to make ice surfaces, or steam, or lightning electrified water surfaces is also very powerful. By itself, that would mostly just be a pretty nice utility spell, but Create or Destroy Water also lets you apply one of the most powerful debuffs in Baldur's Gate 3, Wet. When you cast Create Water over an enemy, they get wet. And not only is getting your enemies wet amazing for fanfiction, it also, in Baldur's Gate 3, doubles cold or lightning damage that they take. Being able to apply vulnerability to a damage type breaks the math of Dungeons & Dragons completely. A fight that was supposed to take 4 turns, if an enemy is taking double damage, takes 2 turns. An enemy that was supposed to survive for 2 turns dies in the first turn and never gets to attack you back. So, being able to apply vulnerability to a damage type that's pretty easy to do, with a level 1 spell, is a ridiculously powerful utility effect. And a lot of builds are built around maximizing Create Water and then applying lightning damage. You can look up my one-shot Lightning Lord build in order to just one-shot enemies immediately before they ever get to act. Create Water is a spell that has changed a little mechanically since my first spell tier list. At the time it was bugged and you could cast a version of it as a cantrip, but that bug has long since been patched out, so you do have to actually spend a spell slot on this, and if you spend a higher level spell slot, you get a bigger AoE of Create Water. But the effect of this spell is ridiculously powerful, because doubling the damage that enemies take, of course, is nonsensically strong. There is one thing that holds Create Water back, though, in Baldur's Gate 3, and that's the existence of the humble water bottle. A lot of the time you can get the effect of Create Water by, instead of spending a spell slot and an action, spending an attack and throwing a water bottle at an enemy. But water bottles, especially in Honor mode where they were made rarer, are actually a fairly valuable resource. So being able to use a first level spell slot to not have to spend one of those water bottles is actually extremely impactful. It sounds weird that preserving bottles of water is one of the biggest resource management concerns for an Honor mode run, but that's actually true for any party that is using wet and cold damage, and so they're definitely going to want Create Water. Even aside from that abuse, though, Create Water is just a great utility spell. You're going to find times where it comes up in lots of encounters all throughout the game. And because of just how impactful the wet condition is, I still can't imagine giving this spell anything other than S tier. Cure Wounds. Cure Wounds is a healing spell. It's touch range, so you have to be in melee range with the creature you're healing. And they get 1d8 plus your spellcasting modifier in healing. So if you're a cleric with 16 wisdom, then they'll get 4.5 average healing from the d8, plus 3 for 7.5 healing on average. The numbers just don't add up on this spell, and this is what makes healing in general a weak primary strategy in Baldur's Gate 3, is that the numbers just don't keep up with incoming damage, and you're spending resources. An enemy attack at level 1 is going to do somewhere between like 7 and 10 damage. A greatsword user, for example, will do 7 damage plus 3 from having 16 strength for a total of 10 damage. And so if Enemies who are attacking you without using a special ability, without spending any resource, are doing 10 damage every turn, and you're healing 7.5 healing every turn. You're not even breaking even, and you're spending spell slots in order to catch up. So healing, just on the face of it, simply does not provide enough value to spend your action on healing with Cure Wounds. If you need to heal using an action, throwing a potion is a much more valuable use of your action to heal. You'll get much higher numbers because healing potions are extremely prevalent in Baldur's Gate 3. And of course, you only need to use one attack to do this. So characters with multiple attacks can actually be better healers than characters casting Cure Wounds. However, there is one use case for Cure Wounds that's new as of patch 8. And that is the existence of the Star Druid. Star Druid's Chalice healing ability allows you to, whenever you cast a healing spell, and it has to be a spell, can't be a potion, you also get to activate the Chalice ability for free and heal an ally at range for a d8 plus your spellcasting modifier. So it sort of doubles the effectiveness of Cure Wounds. Now, even then, most of the time you're going to be using Healing Word, a wildly better spell, in order to trigger Chalice healing. But there are times when you will want to trigger Chalice healing using your action rather than your bonus action. And so the Cure Wounds does now have a very specific use case for Star Druids. It lets you trigger your ability with a much easier set of actions. You now have more control over what action you're using to trigger your ability if you have both Cure Wounds and Healing Word. For that reason, I'm going to put it in C tier technically. It can also be used by dedicated healing builds like Life Clerics for big bursts of healing when you upcast it. Typically not going to be a good use of your action, but can be useful in some circumstances there. And Life Clerics get it by default, so they don't need to waste a spell prepared slot on it. But for the most part, Cure Wounds is an extremely weak spell, only saved by the existence of Star Druid because they sometimes are going to want to weave their actions in such a way where casting a spell using an action is better than casting it using a bonus action. Disguise Self. Disguise Self does what it says on the tin. It lets you pretend to be somebody else. You choose from a big list of pre-generated characters, and your character turns into a copy of that character for the entire day when you cast Disguise Self. It's a ritual spell, so it doesn't require a spell slot to use, which means you can cast it out of combat for free, and you can dispel it at any time if you want to look like yourself again. Disguise Self has tons of cool uses in Baldur's Gate 3. Here's a few of them. Firstly, you can use it to get out of crimes. When an NPC is looking for the person who committed a crime, they actually will not consider you if you're disguised, so you can use it to commit a crime and then get away with it. You can also use it to get the racial attitude bonuses, because most characters in Baldur's Gate 3 will tend to like members of the same race as them more. So if you are talking to a merchant, disguising as a member of that merchant's race will allow you to get a bonus on your bartering prices and everything with that merchant. So you get better prices, you can get out of crimes, you can also do racial specific dialogue. Disguising as a drow in the early game can let you get a lot of the drow-specific dialogue and bypass a bunch of the early game encounters without having to spend any skill checks. So Disguise Self gives you a lot of tools outside of combat to progress the story and gain small advantages. Already, that's really good. But there's also one other thing that Disguise Self does in Baldur's Gate 3 that's extremely powerful, and that's that it lets you use items that are normally restricted to certain races. Items like the Githyanki, the swords that gain bonuses if you're a Githyanki, you can use to their fullest effect if you disguise as a Gith. Items like the Dwarven Thrower that gain a bonus if you're a dwarf, you can use to full effectiveness if you disguise as a dwarf. So you don't actually have to be playing a dwarf in order to get the maximum benefit out of that extremely powerful weapon. In addition to all of those benefits, there are some items in the game that key off of being shapeshifted or disguised, and Disguise Self lets you get those for free without spending resources on them. So you get to use the very powerful effects of, for example, the Shapeshifter's Boon Ring, just by casting Disguise Self on yourself, and then having that ring equipped, and you just get the bonus without spending any resource. So there are a lot of use cases for this spell. It's very powerful. It's not going to win combats on its own, though it will let you skip some. But the number of advantages that you can get by casting this spell at appropriate times over the course of the game are immense. This spell also gets better the more you play the game, because you'll know when there are times where there's a race-specific dialogue or something that you might want to use, and you can use Disguise Self in order to get that. So as you gain more experience, the spell continuously gets stronger as well. It's not quite S tier, I think, because you can definitely play the game without it, but it's a very powerful spell, and we're going to put it in A tier. Next up, Dissonant Whispers. Dissonant Whispers is available to bards and Great Old One warlocks, and is a mixture of a damage spell and a control spell. It has 60-foot range, and does 3d6 of psychic damage to a single target, so okay damage for a first level spell slot. It has a wisdom save for half damage, so you always do at least some damage to the enemy. But if the enemy fails the wisdom save, they also become frightened for 2 turns. A frightened creature cannot move and has disadvantage on their attack rolls, and a melee enemy who can't move is not a threat. So if you can land Dissonant Whispers on a melee enemy, you've effectively stunned them, because they won't be able to move in order to get into melee range and actually use their attacks. 2 turns of stunning a melee enemy is very, very powerful, and Dissonant Whispers doesn't require your concentration, so it will be able to be used alongside concentration spells in order to just shut out melee enemies while also doing great damage. In addition to that, it's a wisdom save, and most enemies that you care about frightening and don't want them to get into melee range will have weak wisdom saves, because if it's, say, an enemy raging barbarian, they're going to have good strength saves, probably decent dex and con saves, but relatively low wisdom, so you're going to land Dissonant Whispers pretty reliably against the targets that it's best against. This is a powerful effect, decent damage for a first level spell slot, also on a class that normally does not get direct damage spells, so is one of the best ways for bards to do damage and just contribute to combat in general, and also is 2 turns of crowd control without your concentration. This is a ridiculously strong effect. You don't need to upcast it, because all you get is additional damage, so unlike Command, you can't hit multiple enemies with it. If you could, it would be incredible. But as a first level spell that just takes a melee enemy out of the fight for 2 solid turns, Dissonant Whispers is incredible. Every bard should be taking this and casting it all the time. Great Old One warlocks benefit a ton from Dissonant Whispers as well. This spell is, again, some of the best non-concentration damage and crowd control in the game. S tier. Divine Favour. Divine Favour is a paladin spell, so like other paladin spells, you have to compare it to a smite. And it does not compare favorably, no pun intended, to using that spell slot on a smite. Divine Favour requires your bonus action to cast, and then uses your concentration to make your weapon attacks do an extra d4 of radiant damage for 3 turns. If you just spent that spell slot on a smite, you get 2d8 radiant damage up front for an average of 9 damage. So if you're only making 1 attack per turn, you deal 7.5 damage with Divine Favour over 3 turns. So it's less damage and takes longer to deal. You get a little more damage once you hit later paladin levels and get extra attack, doing 15 damage compared to the 9 average from a smite. If you get the full 3 turns of attacks with Divine Favour, is a lot better. But even so, at that point, you probably still just want to end fights quickly because you're a paladin, so spending spell slots on Divine Favour is rarely going to be great for a paladin. Just use the spell slots on Smite or Thunderous Smite or something like that instead, because that's a character that's all about burst damage. However, there is a use case for Divine Favour, and that's that it's not just paladins that get it. War Clerics have this as a domain spell. So if you're a character that has a 1-level dip in War Cleric in order to get the bonus action attacks, and is just making a lot of weapon attacks, like say a Sword Bard with a War Cleric dip, or a Fighter with a War Cleric dip for bonus action attacks, then Divine Favour can power up your attacks. And because it is radiant damage, it does work well with Radiating Orb and Reverberation gear. So adding an extra d4 of radiant damage to the attacks of a character who's doing Radiating Orb or Reverberation stuff can be reasonably effective. Even so, is it worth your concentration, a bonus action, and a level 1 spell for a small amount of extra damage? Maybe for some builds. For most builds, it's not going to be. But because War Clerics can use this on weapon attacking builds that have 1 level of War Cleric, I'll give it C tier, though this is another C tier spell where if you didn't cast it, you're probably not missing that much. Enhanced Leap. Enhanced Leap is one of the spells I recently posted about in my video, The Most Underrated Spells in Baldur's Gate 3. So for a demonstration and a more detailed discussion of how to use this spell, definitely check that video out. I show off a bunch of ways in which you can use it. Enhanced Leap is a ritual spell so it doesn't cost a spell slot if cast outside of combat, lasts for 10 turns, and triples the target's jump distance. If you cast this on your entire party, it basically gives your entire party a bonus action teleport for free for 10 turns. You're not spending any resources, it doesn't require your concentration, and tripling your jump distance means that even a character with low jump distance can still reach high ground, get away from enemies super easily using their bonus action, so they can kite enemies backwards, staying out of range of them, or take up positions where enemies can't get to them. There are tons of uses in arenas for Enhanced Leap. If an enemy melee character is on low ground, you can jump up to ceiling beams or height and get away from them. If an enemy archer is on high ground, you can get up to them in order to engage them in melee. You can also just move further every turn because having high jump distance gives you more movement speed. Since you always spend 10 feet of your movement speed to jump, but your jump distance will change. Having Enhanced Leap means that you can get a huge increase to your effective movement distance when you are tripling your jump distance. This spell gives you so much agency in combat, and it's totally free to use. Although it does take some real life time because you have to cast it before combat begins on all of your party members, and unfortunately, unlike Longstrider, you can't upcast it to cast on multiple creatures at once, so you have to individually cast it on each of your party members, but even with that micromanagement, it's well worth the effort. Gaining this much mobility completely for free, and mobility is one of the most important things that you can have in Baldur's Gate, is, it's free. It's super powerful and it's free, and there are no two better things for a spell to be. S tier for Enhanced Leap. Ensnaring Strike. Ensnaring Strike is a ranger spell cast as part of a weapon attack. So you make a normal weapon attack, and then also spend your bonus action and the spell slot, as well as your concentration, in order to cast Ensnaring Strike. If the attack hits the enemy, they have to make a strength save, and if they fail that save, they become ensnared, being unable to move, and taking a d6 of piercing damage every turn for 10 turns. Being able to make a normal weapon attack and then also add a crowd control effect on top of it is very good, because you're not losing any damage output, so you're not costing yourself there's no opportunity cost for using Ensnaring Strike, or low opportunity cost for using Ensnaring Strike, because you're still doing your normal weapon damage, and then on top of that, you might lock an enemy out of the fight completely. A melee enemy that can't move is, of course, not a threat, similar to Dissonant Whispers, and while this takes your concentration, it does last for 10 turns, and it's a ranger spell, and rangers want to be making weapon attacks and are not going to be using their level 1 spell slots for much other than this anyways, so Ensnaring Strike is a great use for that ranger spell. In addition to that, Rangers have access to the Bounty Hunter class feature, which if you take it, gives enemies disadvantage on the saving throw for Ensnaring Strike. While a lot of melee enemies are going to be good at passing strength saves, which is a downside of the spell, is it entangles melee enemies, but is a strength save. It entangles creatures, but is a strength save. Giving them disadvantage means that they will fail that saving throw pretty reliably, even with good strength saves. And if you use it on a rogue type character with low strength but high dexterity, or on a spellcaster that you want to lock into place, they're extremely likely to fail the save. So a ranger with Bounty Hunter can use Ensnaring Strike very reliably. Because it uses your weapon attack, if you're an archer, you can use it at range, and an archer locking enemies in place is very powerful. So this is a pretty powerful effect that has very low cost, just takes your bonus action, and you're still doing your normal weapon damage. So a very solid spell overall. A tier for Ensnaring Strike. Most rangers are going to want to take Bounty Hunter and use Ensnaring Strike pretty frequently. Entangle. Entangle is the first spell that we've talked about whose primary purpose is creating a hazard on the battlefield. We've talked a little bit about this with Chromatic Orb already, but Entangle is the first battlefield control spell where that's the only thing that it does. These spells tend to be pretty good because you can usually hit a lot of enemies in the effect and control the movement or lock down entire encounters, so battlefield control spells tend to be a fairly powerful subset of spells. Entangle in particular is a 60-foot range, 10-foot radius surface, so you cast it on the ground, it makes a 20 feet across circle of twisting vines. It costs your concentration. Enemies inside the spell have to make a strength save or they become entangled. Entangled enemies can't move, you have advantage on attacks against them, and they have disadvantage on attacks against you, so that's a pretty powerful debuff, though the fact that it's a strength save does hurt the spell somewhat because a lot of the enemies that you most want to prevent from moving will have high strength saves, very similar in that way to Ensnaring Strike. Entangle is a pretty good concentration crowd control spell. The effect is really nice, it's a big AoE, lasts for 10 turns so you can keep it going. But there are two major things that hold this spell back a little bit. The first is that it is flammable. There's a lot of random fire damage in Baldur's Gate, and spending your concentration and having the enemies break out of this control spell because someone did a random point of fire damage somewhere on the map is definitely a real problem. And while you can control it to do a little bit of fire damage, making a big fire surface is not what you want to spend a valuable spell slot on. You can do that a lot of other ways. So Entangle being flammable is definitely a real disadvantage. The other disadvantage to this spell is that it's a druid spell, and as a druid, you can, starting at level 2, wild shape into a spider and spit webs for free. Webs are very similar to Entangle, but you get them for free if you're in spider form, and so if you need this effect, being a spider, which is one of the best wild shape forms for a druid, is going to supersede the effect of Entangle a lot of the time, because you're just going to cover the arena in free webs rather than spending your concentration on Entangle. That being said, when you're in human form, the spell still provides a pretty solid debuff over a pretty big area, so if you aren't using fire damage and you're in an encounter where enemies don't use it, Entangle is a very solid control spell at early levels and definitely worth casting. I'm going to give it B tier because its usage is a little more restricted than a lot of other control spells, but the effect is very powerful. Expeditious Retreat. Expeditious Retreat is a bonus action spell that takes your concentration, and when you cast it, you can immediately dash, so you get to move your movement, and then every turn thereafter, as long as you concentrate on it, you can dash as a bonus action again. You can concentrate on it all day. This spell will last up to long rest. So for a level 1 spell slot, you get bonus action dashes the entire day. Now, spending your concentration on this is real cost, especially because it's a sorcerer, wizard, and warlock spell, and those classes will usually have better things to spend their concentration on. But the extra mobility that you get from this is pretty useful. Mobility is always good, and in the early game, this is a great way to get out of a bad situation. Being able to run away from a fight that's turning against you can be very important. There are a couple reasons why this isn't as good as it maybe sounds, though. First is that, obviously, concentration's a real cost. And second is that there's a lot of other ways to get this effect that are maybe stronger. Once you get level 2 spells, Misty Step is just a better escape spell most of the time. And even at level 1, Enhanced Leap makes bonus action jumping, which every character can do, pretty much just as good as bonus action dashing for increasing your mobility. And of course, as a jump, you can go up and down as well. With Enhanced Leap not costing a spell slot and not costing your concentration, you can get the effect of Expeditious Retreat in terms of increasing your mobility basically for free if you have Enhanced Leap available in your party. However, there are a couple bonuses that Expeditious Retreat has. First, although losing your concentration is a real penalty, it can also be a bonus. There are some items, like the Strange Conduit Ring, that trigger off of concentrating on stuff, so having a day-long concentration spell can just be useful for characters using those. And there are some items and effects that trigger off of dashing as well, so having a bonus action dash can specifically be good in order to gain the benefits like lightning charges from the item that gives those when you dash multiple times per turn, using your bonus action dashes from Expeditious Retreat, or without spending your action as well. So there's some synergies with this spell that are actually pretty strong. By default, the mobility version of the spell is okay, but mostly superseded by other things, but there are a couple builds and item synergies that make this spell a little bit more interesting. Overall, I'm going to give it C tier, because you really do need a reason to take Expeditious Retreat, otherwise the cost of a level 1 spell slot and your concentration is very high. But if you do have those synergies, then it can be very much worth it. Faerie Fire. Faerie Fire is a concentration debuff spell. It has a 20-foot radius, which is a huge radius for a level 1 spell, and enemies who are caught within it have to make a dexterity saving throw, or attacks against them gain advantage as long as you maintain concentration on the spell. They also can't turn invisible, and if they were invisible when they failed the save, they lose invisibility. Gaining advantage on attacks against enemies is pretty powerful, but there's a lot of other ways to do that. You can hide before combat starts to gain advantage. You can cast something like Entangle, which gives you advantage on attacks and prevents enemies from moving. You can cast something like Command, which gives you advantage on attacks and costs the enemy their turn and doesn't take your concentration. So the Faerie Fire debuff is not bad, but there's a lot of ways that are generally going to be better. Fog Cloud also provides you advantage on attacks against enemies in exchange for your concentration, but with no saving throw. So, like I said, there's a lot of ways to get the effect of Faerie Fire without using a spell that only does that. You can use a spell that does a bunch more stuff beside. The advantage of Faerie Fire is that it has a gigantic radius, meaning that you'll usually be able to hit a whole encounter with it, and that can be useful, but a lot of the characters that would want to be concentrating on Faerie Fire also just have more important things to concentrate on, so in general, I think that you're usually not going to concentrate on this spell. This spell also specifically counters invisibility, but there's a lot of ways in Baldur's Gate 3 to counter invisibility. Enemies who are wet can't be invisible because they're dripping water, so if you hit an enemy with Create Water, they lose invisibility. And a lot of times you can use AoE damage to just reveal the location of an enemy as well, and then you don't need to worry about them being invisible. So while the invisibility can come up, the loss of invisibility can come up, it mostly isn't going to be a significant deal. All of these things together mean that Faerie Fire is mostly just outclassed at what it's trying to do by other options, but being a weaker version of a bunch of very strong spells is still sometimes an okay thing to be. There may be encounters where you need the extra radius on Faerie Fire, or where the combination of giving advantage on attacks and breaking invisibility is what you're looking for. While it won't come up very often, and most of the time you're going to be using one of the other spells that does the same thing but better, Faerie Fire can still come up, so I'm going to put it in C tier and say that this spell still does have its uses, even though most of the time you'll use something else. False Life. False Life gives you 7 temporary hit points until your next long rest, so basically you cast it, and it prevents the next 7 damage that you would take from enemies. By itself, this is a terrible waste of a level 1 spell slot. 7 damage prevention for a level 1 spell is not a good ratio. And it's also anti-synergistic because you can't use other sources of temp HP since temp HP doesn't stack. There's a lot of good sources of temporary hit points in the early game, so False Life is both weak on the merits and anti-synergistic with other powerful effects. You might wonder why I say False Life is bad and Armour of Agathys is good. Armour of Agathys does damage, so it progresses your game plan. False Life does not progress your game plan, so it's weak numerically and weak conceptually. D tier. Featherfall. Featherfall is a ritual spell, so it doesn't take a spell slot when cast outside of combat, making it effectively free to use when traversing the world, and it just prevents falling damage for 10 turns. It's AoE, so it'll affect your whole party. Obviously, this is useful in a bunch of dungeons to get down from a height, and it lets you take approaches to fights that you wouldn't otherwise be able to take, where you can come up behind enemies and maybe be in a more advantageous situation. You can skip a bunch of traps in a bunch of dungeons as well. You can also skip a bunch of loading screens sometimes in the game by using Featherfall. So for speedrunners, really like this. Very good when combined with Enhanced Leap, because you'll often be up on heights and you don't want to take damage or fall prone when you jump down from those heights. So Featherfalling your party before going into combat can also be useful. Mostly this is for out-of-combat traversal, but in combat arenas with a lot of height, it can be useful to preemptively cast Featherfall in order to use that height more effectively. Traversal spells are pretty helpful in Baldur's Gate, especially before you've memorized all the dungeons and encounters, so having Featherfall ready can be pretty helpful. Unlike tabletop D&D, you have to cast it before you fall. You can't cast it while falling as a reaction, which is how it works in tabletop. So you do need to know that you're about to fall, but getting down from heights without taking damage is just very useful in Baldur's Gate 3. I think Featherfall is the quintessential B-tier spell. It's pretty useful in some scenarios, in certain combat encounters, and it's basically free, so you should usually try to have it. Find Familiar. Find Familiar is a summoning spell. It's a ritual, so it doesn't cost a spell slot, but it can only be used once per short rest per character, so you can't just have infinite familiars. You do have to be careful to keep them alive if you want to always have a familiar active. This is one of the coolest and most versatile spells in the game, and the limits to how powerful it can be are basically only how creative you are and how patient you are. Find Familiar can be used for a huge number of different things. When you cast the spell, you get a choice of cat, crab, frog, rat, raven, or spider. Normally you're going to want to go with the raven because it has flying, so it's very mobile, and it has a blinding attack, which is a pretty good debuff. And once you have a familiar, you can use it for a huge number of things. You can send it to scout. You can use it to drag objects over vents and onto pressure plates and things like that. You can use it to set up threatened spaces to trigger sneak attack by your rogue. You can use its attacks to debuff enemies. You can use it to absorb attacks from enemies because they can attack your familiar. They'll die in one hit, but spending no resources to absorb one hit from an enemy is always pretty powerful. The amount of benefits that you can get from Find Familiar are limited mostly by your creativity and, of course, by your patience, because in order to maximize the spell, you have to do a lot of micromanagement. So for the majority of players, you're not going to be willing to put in the amount of effort that you want in order to get the absolute most out of this spell. It can still be really good, though. Just summoning a Raven Familiar and having it blind your enemies occasionally is really nice and doesn't cost you anything. And so this is still just a very, very powerful spell if you have access to it. There is one thing holding Find Familiar back a little bit, which is the existence of the Cheeky Quasit summon. Most parties are going to get access to that, and it will fill a lot of the roles that you want a familiar for better. But Find Familiar is still just free value, and an enemy occasionally being blinded or wasting an attack on your Raven is very valuable. I'm going to give it A tier because it's an extremely powerful spell, but it does require a lot of management in order to get the most out of it. But if you're a player who is willing to put in that effort, I can definitely see bumping it up to S tier. And you know if that's you, if you love using summons, Find Familiar is obviously an incredible one. Fog Cloud. So we've already talked a little about Fog Cloud during this tier list. It's come up a few times already, so let's go into more detail about why that is. Fog Cloud is a battlefield control spell. You cast it on the ground, and it has a 17-foot radius and takes your concentration. Funnily enough, that 17-foot radius is actually 3 feet less than Faerie Fire's 20-foot radius. Because although they're both 20-foot spells in tabletop D&D, they converted Fog Cloud to metric and made it 5 meters, or 17 feet, and didn't convert Faerie Fire, so it's actually 20 feet. So it's very funny that some distances they converted and some they didn't, and Fog Cloud was unfortunately a victim of shrinkage as a result. Within the area of the Fog Cloud, creatures inside of it are blinded and heavily obscured. There's no saving throw for the blind, so anything that's inside the Fog Cloud, if it's not completely immune to blind, will be blinded, which causes its attacks to have disadvantage and attacks against it to have advantage. So if you put it on your enemies, they have disadvantage, you have advantage. And they're heavily obscured, which basically means it counts as an unlit area, so you can hide even if enemies are looking at it. Enemy vision cones won't extend into the fog cloud. That means there's basically two uses for Fog Cloud. You can cast it in order to create a space for your rogue to hide, or another character to hide inside of it. Marginal, but useful for stealing items in towns and stuff. Having a place where you can guaranteed hide and nobody can see you is very helpful. And you can cast it on enemies to blind them without a saving throw. Any debuff that happens without a saving throw is always worth considering, and Fog Cloud is easy to apply and a pretty bad debuff. Blind is a pretty powerful effect. Enemies who are blinded can't jump because they can't target anything more than 5 feet away from themselves. They have disadvantage on their attack rolls, and they have and you have advantage on attack rolls against them. If you can keep enemies inside the Fog Cloud, that's just going to win an encounter, and there's a lot of good ways to do that. Placing a fog cloud with an enemy on the outer edge of it lets you move your ally next to the fog cloud, and then your ally's not blinded, but are still able to melee attack the enemy. And if they try to move away, they're going to take an attack of opportunity. There's also a lot of enemies in the game, including some powerful bosses that can't move. So if you put Fog Cloud on those, they're just blinded forever with no saving throw, and that's going to make those encounters much easier. So Fog Cloud is just a very powerful debuff with no save in a big AoE, as long as you can fill the relatively simple constraint of keeping enemies inside it. And even if you can't, getting advantage on your attacks against an enemy with no saving throw is still a pretty valuable tool. If you have 3 martial characters and 1 spellcaster, having the spellcaster cast Fog Cloud and then everybody else's attacks are with advantage for the rest of that turn is pretty good. And then you can also potentially make it even better if you can keep the enemy inside the Fog Cloud. So no save debuff, pretty powerful. There are some fights where you can just win the fight outright by casting Fog Cloud, and also it gives you a place to hide so you can steal stuff in town. Just a very solid spell that you're going to be using very, very frequently. I don't think it quite cracks S tier because while there are lots of encounters where Fog Cloud won't be particularly relevant, but the ones where it is good, it's very good. A tier for Fog Cloud. Goodberry. Goodberry is a druid or ranger spell that when cast creates 4 goodberries, which sit in your inventory, last until long rest, and can be eaten to restore 1d4 hit points. So basically you cast it and you make 4 healing potions that are half as effective as the basic healing potion, which heals 2d4. The Goodberries heal 1d4. That's still an okay amount of healing for a first level spell. It's better than Cure Wounds, though it obviously takes your bonus actions to use. And having some extra healing potions can sometimes be useful. It also, the Goodberries count as camp supplies, each is worth 1, so if you spend enough spell slots on casting Goodberry, you can long rest infinitely without spending camp supplies, which means that you can get infinite free spell slot restoration if you have some camp casters casting Goodberry all the time. Most players, I think, are not going to be willing to waste their time doing that. It's certainly not necessary. There are plenty of camp supplies in the game, but it is something that you can do if you want a long rest a lot. Healing potions are so prevalent in Baldur's Gate 3, though, that the ability to summon 4 healing potions, which would be incredible in most tabletop campaigns, is pretty poor in Baldur's Gate 3. You'll just have healing potions that you can use instead of Goodberries, and they heal for more. They can be thrown, unlike the Goodberries, which gives them a lot of extra utility. So in general, you're just going to want to use healing potions, and summoning potions with Goodberry is not particularly effective. If you do want this effect as well, the raspberries that you can find in the first act, you can heal yourself without spending an action at all. They take no action to consume. So the bonus action healing from Goodberries is outdone by some items that you can just find in the game. Goodberry is really a spell that just replaces an item. Other than the use case of infinite long rests, I just don't think that you really want to spend your spell slots on it. So I'm going to say that this is D tier, though if you are long resting after every single fight and using camp casters as well, then Goodberry is a way to make sure that you don't run out of camp supplies. Alright, my friends, that is 26 of the 52 first level spells, so we're halfway there, and since this video is already over an hour, I'm going to split it into 2 parts, just as I did last time I did a spells tier list. As always, of course, if you think that there is a spell that should be moved to a different tier, definitely let me know in the comments and why you think that. I'm very open to moving things around as we construct this tier list, if there are good reasons that people have for changing the tier of any of these spells. So let me know what you think and why. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do this. We will definitely be back, continuing this saga of rating all of the spells in Baldur's Gate 3, so look forward to that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides, future spell tier lists, as well as other tier lists, and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.